The laughter inside the Finch mansion died instantly. One moment, the city's most powerful people were mocking a ragged orphan girl for her absurd claim. The next, a chilling silence fell over the room as she was dragged away by guards. With her last breath of defiance, the girl had revealed an impossible secret on her skin, an eagle-shaped birthmark, the legendary lost crest of the Finch dynasty. The billionaire, Alistair Finch, felt the blood drain from his face. He looked from the mark on the girl's arm to the boy he'd called son for 10 years, and a devastating truth hit him like a thunderbolt. The heir to his entire fortune was a fraud, and his real child was somewhere else in the world, lost. This is just the tip of the iceberg. To find out how this impossible story ends, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. The Finch mansion was not a home. It was a monument to power, and tonight it was on full display. Crystal. Chandeliers dripped light onto guests dressed in jewels and silk, all gathered to celebrate the 10th birthday of Thomas Finch, the heir to a billion-dollar empire. At the center of it all stood Alistair Finch, watching the scene not as a father, but as a king surveying his court. He looked at his son Thomas, a boy dressed in a perfect suit, and saw not a child, but a line on a balance sheet, the asset meant to carry the Finch name forward. A cold, nagging distance always separated them, a flaw in his otherwise perfect world. The moment came for the grand presentation. A cake, taller than the boy himself, was wheeled into the ballroom. Alistair stepped forward, a practiced smile fixed on his face, ready to perform his fatherly duty for the cameras. But as he raised a hand to quiet the crowd, a small disturbance rippled through the guests. A smudge of grey in a world of gold and silver. A young girl, no older than Thomas, with dirt on her cheeks and clothes that had seen far. Better years had slipped past his fortress of security. She moved with a strange, unwavering purpose, her eyes locked on one man. She didn't run, she walked, parting the sea of millionaires as if they were nothing more than statues. She reached the foot of the stage where Alistair and his son stood, the guards finally rushing to intercept her. But they were too late. Her voice, though not loud, cut through the air with chilling clarity. She pointed a trembling finger, not at the billionaire, but at the boy beside him. Looking directly into Alistair's cold grey eyes, she said the words that would shatter everything. "He is not your son." The music screeched to a halt. 100 conversations died in the same breath. Alistair Finch, a man whose name could move markets and bend laws, stood frozen. The perfect facade of his life had just been cracked open by a child who had nothing, and in that crack, a terrible volcanic fury began to build. For a moment, Alistair's shock gave way to there's white-hot fury. A low growl escaped his lips. "Who let this thing in here?" he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. He took a step towards Ilara, his shadow falling over her small frame. "You wander into my home, in front of my guests, to spin pathetic lies. You think you can extort me?" He turned to the crowd, a cruel smirk on his face. "This is what happens when you show the lower class any kindness. The rats get brave and crawl out of the sewers looking for a handout." A wave of relieved, sycophantic laughter swept through the room. The guests, eager to align themselves with power, joined in the mockery. They sneered at the little girl, a pathetic street performer whose act had failed spectacularly. Alistair soaked in their approval, his dominance reaffirmed. With a final dismissive wave of his hand to his guards, he commanded, "Get this filth out of my sight, now." 2 large security men grabbed Ilara's thin arms. She didn't fight, her small body looking impossibly fragile in their grip. But as they began to drag her away, her voice rang out, not with fear, but with a startling power that silenced the laughter. "You are the one who is blind," she cried, her eyes locked on Alistair. "You sit on a throne of lies. The true Finch heir carries the mark of the eagle." With a sudden twist, she yanked her arm just enough to pull back her tattered sleeve. There, on the pale skin of her wrist, was a birthmark so clear, so perfect, it looked as if it had been inked by an artist. It was a soaring eagle, its wings outstretched in silent, undeniable glory. The laughter in the room choked and died. 100 people stopped breathing at once. Alistair felt the blood turn to ice in his veins. It was a forgotten family legend, a whisper from his grandfather's time, the lost crest of the Finch dynasty, now staring back at him from the arm of a nameless orphan. The girl was gone. but her ghost remained. Alistair tried to save the evening, barking at the staff to restart the music and pour more champagne. He told his guests it was a pathetic stunt, the mark a clever tattoo from a desperate street urchin. But his voice was hollow, and his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. The spell of his power had been broken. The guests, whispering amongst themselves, made flimsy excuses and melted away into the night, leaving Alistair alone in the hollow silence of his monument. Hours later, the silence was his enemy. Every tick of the grandfather clock in. The hall was a hammer blow against his certainty. He paced the length of his dark office. The image of the eagle seared into his mind. It couldn't be real. It was a legend, a myth told to children, yet he could see it as clearly as the glass of expensive liquor in his shaking hand. The girl's fierce, knowing eyes, the perfect, impossible shape of the mark. The doubt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He moved through the darkened corridors like a phantom, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. He stopped at the door to his son's room and pushed it open. Thomas was asleep, the picture of peaceful innocence under soft silk sheets. For a fleeting second, Alistair felt a pang of something he couldn't name. He crept to the bedside and gently took the boy's arm, his heart pounding in his ears. He pulled back the pajama sleeve. He checked one wrist, then the other. His search grew more frantic, his hands scanning the boy's skin for any sign, any imperfection. There was nothing, only smooth, unblemished skin. Alistair stumbled back from the bed, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. The absence of the mark was a silent scream, confirming his deepest, most terrifying fear. His arrogance had shattered, leaving behind a desperate, gnawing obsession. He was no longer a king on a throne, but a man lost in a terrifying desert of his own making. He stormed into his office and slammed the intercom button, his knuckles white. His head of security answered immediately. Alistair leaned in close, his voice no longer a command, but a raw, ragged plea. Find her. For 3 days, Alistair's world consisted of nothing but maps, surveillance footage, and the bitter taste of stale coffee. His army of private investigators turned the city upside down, and finally they found her. The location was a crumbling brick orphanage in a part of the city he only saw from the tinted windows of his private jet. He drove there himself, his billion-dollar car a spaceship on a forgotten planet. The poverty was an accusation, and for the first time he felt its sting. He found Ilara in a dusty yard, sitting on the broken chains of a swing set. She wasn't surprised to see him. She looked as if she had been waiting. He approached her, his expensive shoes crunching on gravel, his voice a low command. The mark. Start talking. He was trying to reclaim his power, but his authority was a ghost here. Ilara looked up at him, her eyes, holding no fear, only a profound sadness. The mark on my arm isn't for you, she said softly. It was a sign for me. My mother was a nurse at the hospital where your son was born. She told me the story before she died. Alistair stood frozen as the girl's words unraveled his entire life. She spoke of his late wife, Catherine, a woman consumed by the pressure of the Finch legacy. She spoke of the night their son was born, small and struggling to breathe. And then Ilara twisted the knife, aiming it directly at Alistair's soul. Where were you, Mr. Finch? My mother said your wife was all alone. You were halfway across the world closing a deal. You toasted your success with champagne while your real son was being hidden away like a shameful secret. The story spilled out, each word a drop of poison. Catherine, terrified of presenting a weak heir, had paid Ilara's desperate mother to swap the sickly Finch baby with a strong, healthy boy born to a poor family on the same night. That healthy boy was Thomas. Alistair felt the air leave his lungs, his legs threatening to buckle. He leaned against a rusted pole, his mind screaming. He managed one last, whispered question, the words tasting like ash. My son. What happened to my son? Ilara didn't have to say a word. She simply turned her head. Alistair followed her gaze to a quiet corner of the yard, where a frail, pale boy sat under a dying tree, sketching in a worn notebook. The boy looked up at the sound of their voices, and his grey eyes, so familiar and yet so strange, met Alistair's. In that child's face, Alistair saw a ghost. It was the face of his own father, looking back at him from the son he never even knew existed. Alistair took a step, then another. The few yards that separated him from the boy felt like a vast, empty desert. The CEO, the titan of industry, the king of a glass and steel world, was gone. In his place stood only a man, hollowed out by a truth he could not escape. His immense fortune, his global power, all of it was meaningless in this dusty yard. He was the beggar here, and the orphan sitting under the tree held everything he now needed. He stood before Leo, a giant of a man rendered speechless. The boy looked up from his sketchbook, his gaze steady and curious, not intimidated. Alistair opened his mouth, but only a choked sound came out. Ilara stepped between them, her presence a gentle bridge over an impossible gap. "Leo," she said softly, "this is Alistair. Finch, he's your father." Leo didn't gasp or cry out. He just watched Alistair with an old soul's quiet acceptance, as if a question he'd always carried had finally been answered. Finding his voice, Alistair fell back on the only tool he knew: money. "I can fix this," he said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I'll get you out of here. The best doctors, the best schools, a room bigger than this entire building. Anything you want, it's yours." He was trying to make a deal with fate, to buy back the years he had lost. But Leo wasn't looking at the billionaire. He was looking at the man. He held up his sketchbook. On the page was a drawing of a lonely king, standing on a mountain of gold, reaching for a single distant star. In a soft, clear voice that held no accusation, only curiosity, Leo asked the question that would shatter Alistair completely. "Were you busy collecting all your gold?" he asked. "Is that why it took you so long to find me?" The innocent question struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. A dry, ragged sob escaped his throat as the dam of a lifetime of repressed emotion finally broke. But before he could answer, the boy hunched over, his small body seized by a deep, rattling coughing fit that left him breathless and pale. The sound cut through Alistair's grief like a surgeon's scalpel. He realized with absolute terror that all his money could not buy more time, and the truth had arrived just in time for him to watch his real son die. The sterile white hospital wing was the opposite of the orphanage, but it felt just as hopeless. Alistair had used his fortune to summon the world's best doctors, turning a floor of the city's top medical center into a private command post. But their faces were grim. The diagnosis was delivered in cold clinical terms: severe aplastic anemia. Leo's body was failing. Without a bone marrow transplant, he had weeks, maybe a month, left to live. Alistair's first instinct was primal. "Test me," he ordered the doctors. Now. It was a desperate, burning hope, a chance to physically give a part of himself to his son, to erase the past with a single redeeming act. The lead physician returned hours later, his expression somber. The words were quiet, but they landed like a punch to the gut. "I'm sorry, Mr. Finch, you're not a match." For the second time in days, Alistair felt the crushing weight of his own powerlessness. All the money in the world couldn't change his own blood, couldn't fix the one thing that mattered. He was a king with an empty treasury, a father who could not save his own child. There was only one other real possibility. "The best chance for a perfect match is a full sibling," the doctor explained gently. The name hung unspoken in the air between them: Thomas. But as Alistair absorbed this, his phone vibrated with a call from his chief legal counsel. The past had come roaring back to life. Martha, the nurse who had orchestrated the swap with his late wife, had resurfaced. She knew who Thomas was. She knew Leo was dying, and she had a lawyer. Her demand was not for a payoff, it was for a king's ransom. Half of Alistair's fortune for a chance to save his son's life. Back in his skyscraper office, surrounded by his team of ruthless lawyers, Alistair saw the old version of himself reflected in their predatory smiles. They laid out the battle plan. They would destroy Martha in court, paint her as a blackmailer, prove her an unfit mother, and take custody of Thomas by force. It was the Finch way, the path of total domination. But as Alistair listened to their strategy of annihilation, he felt a sickening sense of dread. He could unleash his monsters to save his son, but he knew in his gut that if he did, the man he was trying to become would die in the process. He had to make a choice: the king or the father. Back in the boardroom, Alistair Finch looked at the predatory faces of his legal team and saw a reflection of the man he no longer wanted to be. With a calm that shocked them all into silence, he gave his final order. "There will be no lawsuit. There will be no fight. You're all fired." He walked out of the room, leaving his old life behind. His next call was not to another lawyer, but to Martha's. He requested a meeting, not in an office, but in a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. He would go alone. Martha arrived looking like a cornered animal, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. She sat opposite him, clutching her purse like a shield. Before he could speak, she launched into her prepared speech, her voice trembling as she demanded the fortune her lawyer had told her to. Alistair listened patiently, without interruption. When she was finished, the silence stretched between them, thick with tension. He finally leaned forward, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "You're right to ask for it," he said, and the words stunned her. "In fact, you're asking the wrong person. You should be asking for more." He took a deep breath, and then he performed the hardest act of his life. He surrendered. "This is not your fault, Martha. It's mine." He confessed everything. His cold ambition, his emotional absence, the way he abandoned his wife to face her fears alone. "I created a vacuum of fear and desperation, and she did what she thought she had to do to survive in my world. I failed her. I failed the son I raised, and I failed the son I never knew. The blame for all of it is mine, and for that I am truly sorry." His confession was not a strategy. It was the truth, and it hung in the air with the weight of a lifetime of regret. The anger in Martha's eyes dissolved, replaced by the tears she had held back for a decade. Alistair then made his real offer, not a payoff but a covenant. He would establish a lifelong trust for both her and Thomas, ensuring their security forever. "Thomas is my son too," Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion. "I raised him. I love him. I will not abandon him, just as I will not abandon Leo." He wasn't choosing between them. He was choosing to be a father to both. Through her tears, Martha nodded, the years of guilt washing away. "Let's go save our boy," she whispered. Alistair had sacrificed the one thing he always protected, his pride, and in doing so, he had liberated them all. The hospital waiting room was filled not with executives and assistants, but with a strange new family forged in crisis. Alistair sat not with his phone to his ear, but with a cup of coffee for Martha. Thomas, brave and exhausted, leaned against him, while Ilara sat quietly, a calming presence in the storm of anxiety. They were not connected by blood or status, but by a fragile, shared hope for the boy in the operating room. This was Alistair's new world, and he found, to his surprise, that it was the first place he had ever truly felt at home. When the surgeon finally appeared, his tired face broke into a reassuring smile. "The procedure was a complete success," he announced. "His body is accepting the transplant. The first signs are as good as we could have possibly hoped for." A collective, shuddering sigh of relief filled the room. Martha wept openly, and Alistair pulled Thomas into a fierce hug, his voice thick as he called his son a hero. The war was over. The long, slow process of healing could now begin. In the weeks that followed, the Finch Tower stood empty of its CEO. Alistair's office was now a sterile hospital room, his work replaced by a singular, vital purpose. He spent his days by Leo's bedside, not barking orders into a phone, but reading adventure stories in a clumsy, unpracticed voice. He was there when Leo woke up, and he was there when he fell asleep. He was simply present, and in those quiet, shared moments, the ice around Alistair's own heart continued to melt away. He was learning, day by day, how to be a father. He sat Thomas down and told him the entire truth, not with shame, but with an honesty that gave the boy the respect he deserved. "Blood doesn't make a family, son," Alistair said, looking him in the eye. "Love does. Leo is the son I lost, but you are the son I raised. And now, I am lucky enough to have you both." As Leo's physical body healed, as color returned to his cheeks and his weak cough was replaced by a soft laugh, the soul of their new family healed alongside him. The lies were gone, replaced by a complicated but beautiful truth. The boy was getting better, and the man had become whole. 1 year later, the Finch mansion was unrecognizable. The cold, museum-like silence was gone, replaced by the echoes of laughter and the thud of a soccer ball against a wall. Children's drawings were taped to the billion-dollar refrigerator, and a half-finished board game sat on a table that was once reserved for heads of state. The mansion, after all these years, had finally become a home, and Alistair Finch had finally become a father. The man who once wore power like a suit of armor now wore a simple sweater, often stained with grass from the backyard. He spent his evenings not closing deals but helping with homework. He attended parent-teacher conferences for both of his sons, and he knew their favorite foods, their secret fears, and the sound of their individual laughter. The hollow ache in his chest, the wound that had driven his cold ambition, had been filled. His work had changed too. Standing at a press conference with Ilara in the Mai, front row as the guest of honor, Alistair announced the launch of the Finch Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar initiative to fund and rebuild under-resourced orphanages and pediatric hospitals across the country. His new legacy was not in acquiring, but in giving. He was no longer building an empire of glass and steel, but one of hope and second chances. That evening, as the sun set, Alistair sat on a bench in his garden. On one side, Leo, now healthy and vibrant, leaned his head against his father's shoulder. On the other, Thomas showed him a video on his phone, the two of them laughing together. Alistair looked at his two sons, the one born of his blood and the one raised by his heart, and felt a profound peace. The orphan girl's words had once shattered his world, but she had given him a new one. He had lost a false heir, only to gain two true sons, and in doing so, had finally built a legacy that was worth leaving behind. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more exciting videos like this. Leave your like to support us and activate notifications so you don't miss any news. This helps us continue to create the best for you. Until the next video.